Hello, this is Dr. Scott Denstead, founder of EZWxBrief, your best online source for aviation weather and education. Welcome to episode 18 of EZWxChat, a program to discuss topics related to aviation weather. Well, thanks for joining. This is going to be a kind of quicker EZWxChat today. However, I want to discuss some of the challenges related to flying in and around areas of tropical remnants. Since we have such a tropical storm, and it used to be Hurricane Ida, to talk about, this is probably a good time to discuss this particular subject. There are some concerns that you definitely want to have with respect to landfalling tropical systems. Now, in this particular situation, as we know if you've been listening to the news and such, Ida came on shore as a strong Category 4 storm with 150 mile per hour winds. I've seen reports of gusts as high as 172 knots, or I should say 172 miles per hour. So that's a pretty potent system, probably one of the strongest hurricanes to hit the Gulf Coast in quite some time. And certainly no pilot would ever fly into it purposely, unless, for instance, you are a hurricane hunter. But we generally would avoid flying directly into a storm like this. But what happens when that storm makes landfall and then eventually dissipates? As you can see here, 24 hours ago, we were dealing with Tropical Storm Ida. And the interesting thing about this particular storm is it remained a Category 4 hurricane for about 6 hours, which is really impressive. And then eventually it drops down to a Category 3, 2, 1, and so on. But the fact that it maintained its strength for that long is a pretty good testament to just how significant this storm was and how much damage it will have done throughout the entire area around New Orleans and elsewhere. Nevertheless, when that storm eventually begins to dissipate, they downgrade it to a tropical storm and eventually down to what's called a tropical depression, and then eventually it will become a extratropical cyclone. But for now, in its progression here, it's kind of sitting out there by itself. This is the latest surface analysis here, valid at 15Z. The 18Z chart might be out, so if we refresh this, we might get the latest chart. Not quite yet. But even so, this is a case where we are looking at a pretty significant area of low pressure that stems from a hurricane that exceeded or essentially was a strong Category 4. And so that in of itself demands a little bit of extra respect. So now this doesn't have any frontal systems associated with it. You see a little bit of trough that's drawn in there. It's the beginnings of what eventually will become an extratropical system, and it will turn into a weather system that eventually starts to be able to deal with frontal systems and separation of air masses as it kind of merges into the jet stream to the north. And what you'll notice is that this still packs a pretty good punch, even though it is in a position where it is dissipating. Don't let that particular aspect of this fool you. In fact, it's real important to completely understand and kind of gravitate towards being a little bit more cautious in and around a system like this. There can be still pretty strong winds. There definitely can be the possibility of significant thunderstorms and even some convection, a fair amount of convection that does not contain any lightning associated with it. It's very common for that to occur, but the biggest threat is the possibility of tornadic thunderstorms in areas where, when you look at the actual overall depiction on NextRad as we'll look, it may not look all that significant. So when we want to see any of these storms in terms of kind of dissecting them, it's usually associated with a kind of a rain bands that work their way around the storm itself, and they tend to be on the eastern or kind of northeastern quadrant especially, but they can extend way down, sort of like a frontal system, if you will, but kind of extend way down and produce some really significant convection that tends to kind of train over the same area. So the concept of training means that that particular area of weather just persists and the cells kind of follow along like a train on tracks, and that can increase the amount of flooding that occurs associated with this. And most of the time when the storm moves inland, the real threat is flooding and the possibility of small tornadoes in terms of damage to the to structures and such on the surface. So when we look at the depiction in a composite reflectivity scenario, you can still see the kind of the hurricane or tropical system look and feel to it, and you can see the rotation of that over time. But you also notice that you've got these bands of pretty heavy significant convection along there, and some of those can actually be severe. Here's a severe thunderstorm warning right on the border between Georgia and South Carolina, and it's not uncommon to also see tornadic warnings as well for typically small tornadoes. Usually hail is not a big problem in these systems. It's mostly dealing with strong winds at the surface as well as the possibility of tornadoes. The other aspect of this, it generally takes up a lot of real estate. Most of these weather systems do take a fair amount of real estate. Now, you may look up here and look at the returns and not really feel that this is all that threatening. And there happens to be another area of weather up to the north, and that's mainly dealing with a frontal system, less dealing with the tropical system itself, but more of a squeeze play between the front and essentially the tropical system moving up to the north and east with time. But certainly if you look at any of these cells here, they look pretty significant, so you would be very careful about flying essentially in those. But the real threat is, especially around where the eye is, there's a lot of shear in the atmosphere, and it's not uncommon to see one of these cells spin up a small tornado in there. And that usually happens on the kind of northeastern quadrant of that storm. And of course, as that storm continues to dissipate over time, it'll be less and less of a threat in this particular area. But usually it's the 1, 2, or 3 days beyond that you typically will have some problems. I know for a fact that when I was living up in the Baltimore area, there was the remnants of Andrew that came through, and a small EF0 tornado spun up and just 10-15 miles north of where I lived and did some pretty good damage overall. But there was no lightning in these cells, but it produced some strong wind that kind of bent trees over to the point where there was a number of those trees that actually broke. So that's the real concern with these. If you happen to fly through, even onboard radar or your NextRad or data link weather that you're seeing, this might not look all that significant, but it certainly can be problematic. And so when we look at the overall convective threat here, let's look at the day one convective outlook from the Storm Prediction Center. Sure enough, you can see very easily here that there's kind of the center of the storm is moving up in towards the Nashville area, and we have a slight risk of severe weather here as well as up to the north in the mid-Atlantic. Again, this is probably not directly related in the mid-Atlantic to the remnants of Ida, but this certainly is. So all this marginal risk and slight risk means that you could see a spin up of tornadic thunderstorms or potentially strong winds, and you can actually look at that. So if I look at the tornado probabilities, they're definitely higher in that area. If you look at the wind probabilities, they're higher. This was actually up here, so this is probably more related to a separate entity, the fact that it's a 15% risk of strong winds, and generally speaking, hail is not a problem with these kind of systems that are dissipating. And then we can look at what's happening on day 2 as that remnants of Ida are moving up into the mid-Atlantic. Then we end up with, again, on the kind of the easterly side, we end up with the possibility of significant severe thunderstorms. So this is an enhanced risk area as that weather system moves up on the coast. So we can see that when we look at the prog charts, you'll see the storm moves up here and eventually ends up right along the mid-Atlantic area and starts to develop into more of a frontal-based extratropical, or they call post-tropical storm, Ida here. But for sure, as that weather system is moving from Wednesday into Thursday up into that area, the possibility of some severe weather certainly exists. And it's, again, not uncommon for it to spin up tornadoes, with not having a significant amount of lightning and also not having a significant radar return in association with that. So the best strategy for dealing with this type of convection is to stay away from it if possible. So when you are planning to fly around it, certainly the possibility of going through an area where you think it's kind of light area of weather, not much in the way of significant returns here, you could certainly give that a try, but I would caution against doing that, again, simply because, especially if you're trying to fly through an area that's on the eastern side, this kind of northeasterly quadrant, that's where you're going to see the most significant weather, or any rain bands that extend outward from that storm itself. Although on the backside of this, probably not as much of a threat in terms of the overall convective threat in that particular area and getting convective turbulence, but you still have a fairly decent amount of shear in the atmosphere. And you can see that if you go to the GFS model and go to the 500 millibar chart, you're definitely going to see the fact that there's a lot of vorticity associated with this weather system. And again, that's kind of spinning up, and you could potentially get some pretty good shearing in some of that convection that develops over the next day or two. But it is, without a doubt, important to keep an eye on where that weather is located, where those clouds and such are located that are producing that precipitation, simply due to the threats of possible shear in the atmosphere. The other aspect of this is that you may not typically see a lot of pilot weather reports. If we go to the map, for instance, and look and see what's happening from that standpoint, most pilots do kind of stay away from this kind of weather system, but I've seen with this weather system several reports of severe turbulence in many areas for pilots that did make the attempt to fly through it. And we see that if we look at the pilot weather reports, and we push that back to there, and let's make sure we're looking at what's happening in the last 4 hours or so. and we're just looking at turbulence reports here. And you do see that we're dealing with essentially, here's a report of severe turbulence. This is essentially at, look at this, it's around 5,000 feet. And again, severe turbulence between 5 and 7. So this particular situation, there was enough shear in the atmosphere of stronger wind speeds with the fact of you may have some rotation, some turning in the atmosphere as well. That's going to potentially produce an area of turbulent weather. You can also have, essentially, you happen to get in a pretty strong updraft of one of these cells, and it doesn't have to necessarily be one that is looks really nasty, and you can essentially at that point in time also understand the fact of you're increasing your risk by flying through those regions in and around this system. This is a case of, again, severe turbulence here at 3,000 feet. And then you'll see lots and lots of moderate reports of turbulence in and around this particular area. So even though you see here, for instance, there is a convective sigmet here, it's pretty important to pay close attention to that. I know I've heard from some folks that say, oh, I don't look at convective sigmets, they're just, they don't help me at all. Well, this is again a good area that says if you had to kind of choose what to fly through, it would probably not want to be in an area where you have these convective sigmets issued, especially in and around one of these remnants of the tropical system. Now, does that mean it's still safe to fly through some of the other precipitation? Possibly, but there's no real way to know unless you are getting a lot of pilot reports that suggest that maybe this was, these are areas of light rain, but it's smooth conditions getting in. And it's also important, if you happen to be flying through those areas, take the risk and you manage to get through and you have little or no turbulence, good idea to report that so other folks understand what's going on. And it also helps the meteorologists who issue the various different sigmets and convective sigmets as well as the G-air mets. Right now I only have, out of the sigmets, only have the convection turret on. I don't think there would be any turbulence. Most of the turbulence here is going to be driven by convection, not necessarily by clear air turbulence per se. But that is another thing I would look at, just in the event, especially if you happen to be flying it higher in the flight levels, it might be important to look at where the possibility of convection would be, and also take a look for these center weather advisories too, as a way of kind of understanding what's happening from the overall depiction. But most of the significant clear air turbulence will likely be at higher altitudes than it would be at lower altitudes where most general aviation fly. So we have to rely a lot more on the convective sigmets that occur in that area. So certainly flying outside of these convective sigmet areas is a really smart idea, but also keep in mind that that area of weather is moving and certainly evolving, and it's not a bad idea to take a look at these convective outlooks from the Aviation Weather Center. And any of these larger areas here means that in the next 2 to 6 hours, and if you look at the dates on here, this will show the outlook is valid from like 21Z to 02Z, so that's that kind of 2 to 6 hour window. And as a result of that, you'll want to make sure that you understand that in that 2 to 6 hour window, we could see convection develop that meets that criteria for embedded thunderstorms, for the possibility of, I'm going to say, embedded convection, the possibility of severe thunderstorms, line or area thunderstorms could be in that region. So let's just quick summary here. Overall, These remnant tropical systems can have a lot of shear in the atmosphere. When you're looking at those specifically to determine whether it's safe to fly through or not, give it a lot more of a respect than you would other light areas of precipitation. You won't have much in the way of lightning, but can still develop small tornadoes in some of these cells, and certainly pay attention to those convective sigmets where they are, because that's where the forecasters have produced a kind of a warning that this could be dangerous for pilots flying through this area. And if you do happen to fly through an area, make sure that you're giving a good pilot report. So that wraps up episode 18 of Easy Weather Chat. My name is Dr. Scott Denstead, and as always, I hope you enjoy the simplicity of Easy Weather Brief.